What's Moscow's reasoning behind delivering on the missile supply deal?
Well, the first thing you have to understand is these are old existing contracts that were signed before the Syrian conflict even began. So in some ways, Russia is obligated to fulfill these contracts. So that's the one way of looking at it. But it is interesting, the timing today, in the wake of the EU allowing this arms embargo to expire, this paves the way for different countries to individually start arming the rebels. So the Foreign Ministry and the Russian President's office, they have expressed their disappointment in this decision, saying that it undermines the international peace process, something that they've been working very hard for. In fact, this week, Lavrov and Kerry meeting to try and get something going on that side of things.
Yeah, and we know the peace conference will be taking place later.
Indeed. And what Russia is saying is that this move by the EU is a double standard policy which directly affects the prospect of having an international peace conference on the topic of Syria. So the timing is very interesting, but the bottom line is that these are old contracts, existing contracts for a defensive weapon for the Assad regime.
Okay, now another question here is, can Russia's defense systems be used to influence events on the ground in Syria?
The short answer is no, but obviously it's a little bit more complicated than that. The S300 is an air defensive weapon, and it cannot be used in ground-to-ground combat. It can't be used against the rebel forces, if you will. It's specifically designed for air combat. Now, Russia is using this as an opportunity to reiterate that point, something that they've been saying all along. Now, the controversy, of course, is the international community looks at this as Russia is siding with the Assad regime. They're arming Assad. This is not the case. As we mentioned before, these are old contracts.
Yes, they have to carry on.
They have to carry out.
That you mentioned, yes.
But the thing of it is that these are defensive weapons. And Russia says that this is specifically even a stabilizing factor, because what it does is it prevents hothead regimes, other countries, foreign forces from getting involved in the Syrian conflict.
Exactly, because
the arms embargo is a bit of a fiction anyways. The arms are pouring into the opposition in Syria. They're coming from Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They're undoubtedly being organized by the United States and the other NATO powers. What they really mean is that they want to send heavier weapons in, and because the opposition has suffered serious setbacks recently. And so we see an all-out push going on as the proposed peace conference approaches on both the civil level and the military level to try to strengthen the opposition, which is dependent upon the support that it's receiving from outside. Otherwise, it does not have any hope for victory and, in fact, would be defeated. It's clear that the leading NATO powers, the U.S., Britain, and France, are leading the way, and that their allies or client states in the Middle East have all joined in this effort. And what's really remarkable about it is that we have this under the pretense of concern for human rights and democracy in Syria. And Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, these are all family monarchies. They are united in their objective, and their objective is to bring down the government in Syria, to replace it with one that would be amenable to U.S. interest as part of strategy.
These agitations against Assad started in 2003, at least what's known to us openly. And there was, in fact, an article written in the Time magazine in December of 2006, which mentioned there had been secret meetings going on, and they cited some secret documents in which it was stated that the opposition was being nurtured in Europe with America's support. So this much we know. And at the same time, we know that John McCain, Senator McCain, he went to Syria to meet with the Free Syrian Liberation Army, whatever they like to call them, the opposition. So America is involved in all this. I don't believe America wants a peaceful resolution to the conflict. America started it. I don't think that Senator McCain would take it upon himself to go to Syria and meet with the opposition had he not had a nod from the government. Otherwise, he would be locked up the minute he returned.
Senator John McCain apparently crossed the border from Turkey into Syria and met with senior rebel leaders and has called for more support, direct U.S. support for the rebels in Syria, including direct training. He's called for American targeted airstrikes on various Assad military installations, particularly anti-aircraft guns. And he's called for other kind of direct measures. Around the same time, the European Union has just met and dropped their sanctions because they couldn't agree to extend them, which now will allow countries of Europe, if they choose, to send weapons. All of this is leading towards a pressure towards sending heavy weapons to the rebels. And of course, the Russians are saying this is going to scuttle any possibility of some kind of peace agreement. So what do you make of all this?
Well, I think that the timing of both McCain's visit and the EU decision are very much tied to the real urgency that's underlying the arrangements between the U.S. and Russia about what they're calling Geneva II, the second set of efforts to get a peace conference underway that would involve both sides in Syria, both the opposition side and the government side. There are all kinds of reasons why it's going to be so difficult, not least the opposition itself is completely divided. They just spent 5 days of what was supposed to be a 3-day conference and ended up unable to choose new representatives. The hope was that they would choose new, more Western-oriented, more liberal-oriented, those that people in the U.S. supporting direct intervention say those are the good guys. They're the ones we want to send arms to. And it's essentially acknowledged that it's really the Islamist forces who are the far better fighters. They're the ones with the arms now. And they're clearly the ones who would get control of the vast majority of arms because the other side simply doesn't have the presence on the ground militarily to move in. So that's one set of problems. The other set of problems is the whole notion, of course, of what John McCain and the other neocons in the U.S. are pushing has proved itself over and over again as a failed strategy. The idea that you can go in and begin a process by bombing the country, which is what you have to do to start a so-called no-fly zone. First, you have to take out all the anti-aircraft batteries. Now, in Syria, which has one of the most advanced, one of the most sophisticated and strongest anti-aircraft systems in the entire Middle East, many of those batteries are in heavily populated areas. That means that any effort to take out the anti-aircraft capacity is going to create enormous numbers of Syrian civilian deaths. Which, of course, is an appalling idea as something that's supposedly designed to stop the killing of civilians. So you have that whole set of contradictions. You have the Europeans, led by the French and the Brits, saying that they will refuse to allow an extension of the embargo on arming the rebels because they intend to send arms very quickly. Opposition forces, including Austria and other countries in the EU, are saying this is a disaster. This is going to undermine the entire effort towards a peace deal, which is exactly what the Russians are saying as well. The Obama administration has not commented yet on what they think about that European decision. But of course, if both sides are continuing to arm their clients in Syria, if the Russians and Iran continue to arm the Syrian government, and if Britain and France, as well as Qatar and Saudi and helped by Turkey, and presumably with U.S. approval and U.S. arms ultimately, are continuing and escalating the arming of the rebel side, this is a recipe for long-term, virtually permanent civil war in Syria. Because we have to keep in mind, Paul, this is not just about an opposition movement fighting to overthrow a regime. You now have 5 separate wars being waged in Syria, only one of which is the war between Syrian people, some of them, and the regime, a very repressive regime. You also have a sectarian war that's region-wide. You have a regional fight for power between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and somewhat Turkey on one side and Iran on the other side. You have a global war over naval bases between the U.S. and Russia, and you have the long-standing war between the U.S. and Israel on one hand and Iran on the other, all being fought to the last Syrian. So the people of Syria are paying this enormous price for a complicated, both local, regional, and international war whose victory can only be lost. Nobody's going to win here. The only way this is going to end is through some kind of negotiations. And the only real question is, do those negotiations begin now? Or do we have to see another 10 or 20 or another 100,000 civilian deaths before those negotiations go forward. Well, the timing of this is very closely tied to these discussions that are underway now in Paris between the Russians and the U.S. This is what Secretary Kerry is focusing on. I think that's why we have not seen the U.S. response to the European move yet, because it's got to be undermining exactly what the U.S. is trying to do. The neocons have proved themselves capable, once again, of scuttling anything that remotely has a possibility of leading to peace talks, leading to a solution that would not be based on military victory by either side. Somehow McCain and his friends have convinced themselves that they will be able to be the supporters of a, quote, winning side in Syria, when all the evidence points to exactly the opposite, that there will be no military victory. There will be no winning side militarily. The only thing we're going to see are more and more losers among the Syrian people.
And we shouldn't forget that when McCain ran for president, his foreign policy was practically to restart the Cold War with Russia. It was more anti-Russian rhetoric than anything to do with Iraq or Afghanistan in McCain's foreign policy.
And that's certainly one of the factors going into his visit. He's deliberately undermining a set of negotiation possibilities that would involve Russia very directly with the U.S. and that would put Russia in a very powerful position with the U.S. as co-sponsors of that negotiating process.
It should also be added that Russia continues to arm Assad, and it doesn't matter how many neighborhoods and how many Syrian civilians the Assad regime kills in order to maintain their power. Russia keeps sending arms there. It's another piece of the component here. Russia could also be putting some pressure on Assad and does not seem to really want to do so.
This is what I was saying earlier, that as long as both sides are continuing to arm their respective partners inside Syria, it doesn't matter what negotiations go forward. The fighting is going to continue.
And from the Israeli point of view, it seems they've come around to the point of view that this actually is probably the best for them. Civil war that doesn't end, a weak Assad, disorderly opposition, and chaos they can take advantage of when they need to, drop in and stop an arms shipment going to Hezbollah.
I think they're moving in that direction now. I don't think that's by far their choice. I think their choice would still be greater control, greater central control, as they had under all the years of both Assads, father and son, both of whom kept the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights, quiet, kept the border quiet, kept the level of cross-border violence tamped down. So that really their preference. I don't think that's changed. I think they're dealing with the options on the ground and realizing that that's no longer an option. There is a civil war underway. I don't think their choice right now would be the overthrow of Assad. I think it would be to stabilize the situation at a somewhat lower level of violence, because there's such a danger of direct intervention coming. One of the things that is quite likely, if there is a third, there's now been 2 sets of Israeli direct assaults on Syria. If there's a third, Assad has said that his military would respond directly against Israel. That may be simply bombast, but if it were true, if he felt he had to do that to keep his credibility, both inside the country among those significant, although smaller and smaller numbers of Syrians who still support his regime, and more importantly, outside, further out in the region, where there is still this illusion that the Assad regime somehow represents a resistance force of some sort, despite all evidence to the contrary, that to keep that, he must somehow respond militarily to any further Israeli attack. That would mean a very dangerous escalation.
And the Israelis can't be minding very much that Hezbollah has thrown its hat fully into the Syrian war. Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah, said we're fully committed to the end, and preparing Lebanese people for a lot more dead Hezbollah fighters coming back from Syria.
That's true, although it's not at all clear what the result is going to be of Nasrallah's engagement on that level. There's already unease among supporters of Hezbollah, and not necessarily, as far as I know, from members of the Hezbollah militia, but inside Lebanon in general, where Hezbollah has a lot of support from non-members who see it as very much at the center of the legitimate political composition in Lebanon, very much part of the government and the parliament. There's a great deal of unease about that position that Nasrallah has spelled out. So I don't think we know yet what the result is going to be of Nasrallah's full and official embrace of the Assad regime.
And still tens of thousands of Syrian refugees, a catastrophic humanitarian disaster, and next to no world public opinion, world media paying any attention to it.
Well, one of the things that we're seeing is that the UN is already faced with having to cut back on rations, on health supplies, on everything it needs in the camps. But the other reality is that many of the hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees outside the country are not in separate camps. They've found places to live with families in cities, in towns. So it's not as visible as the huge refugee populations that we're accustomed to seeing in other refugee crises, whether it's Darfur, whether it was Afghan refugees in Iran or Afghan refugees in Pakistan. Only some of the Syrian refugees are in camps. Others are facing poverty, lack of education, lack of healthcare, but living in ordinary towns and cities and villages in the neighboring countries, whether it's in Turkey, in Jordan, in all of the countries neighboring Syria, with the exception of Israel, who is not allowed in any refugees. All of the others are taking care of them in many cases in cities, so it's not as visible. And that's a huge crisis because it's very much what's known as the CNN factor that the UN depends on to get countries, particularly the US, to escalate its pledges, but most importantly, to make good on the pledges that it's already made.
Currently, the Israeli army is superior to all the armies of the region, including the Syrian army, and it's superior in the air force. The Israeli air force is much more developed and much more bigger and sophisticated than the air force of Syria and other countries. Because of that, and because of the freedom of movement for the Israeli Air Force over the space of Lebanon, airspace of Lebanon and Syria, and due to the Israeli involvement in the current crisis in Syria, Russia equipped Syria with a system S300, and yesterday President Assad said it's already in possession of a batch of these missiles, and they are waiting for another shipment of missiles S300. The characteristics of this missile is very important and sophisticated. It can engage with targets out to 195 kilometers and up to altitude of 32 kilometers, and with a minimum altitude down to 25 meters. It can engage with ballistic missiles, both of short range and medium range. And the head of the missile and the guidance system are not subject to any kind of jamming, and they do not affect with the jamming systems of the Israeli radar and electronic warfare. So because of that, the United States, Israel, and Europe, all of them are protesting equipping the Syrian army with this kind of missiles. But furthermore, these missiles are not an offensive weapon. They are a defensive weapon that
Israel intensifies its war rhetoric, this time under the pretext of a Russian plan to deliver its S300 missile defense systems to Syria. Israel's Minister of Military Affairs says the anti-aircraft system this time for Syria has not yet left Russia, but Israel will know how to act if it does leave. He has even threatened that Tel Aviv could use force to prevent the delivery. Israel's Strategic Affairs and Intelligence Minister has also warned against the Russian missile defense systems, saying they could be used against Israeli interests. The Russian Foreign Ministry has said Moscow will deliver the sophisticated systems to deter foreign military intervention in Syria. The announcement comes as Western countries are enhancing their support for insurgents in Syria. Damascus blames the insurgents for the 2-year-long unrest, which the UN says has left tens of thousands of people dead. The sale and purchase of weapons are not new in the international arena. The hue and cry from Israeli officials seems meaningless, as Tel Aviv itself is the world's major receiver and supplier of lethal weapons. Meanwhile, the Russian decision cannot be seen without seeing it in the context of NATO's missile deployments in Turkey, as well as frequent US and Israeli war games in the region. Just days after US-led naval exercises in the Persian Gulf, Israel has started its military buildup in the occupied Golan Heights by launching a massive drill over there. The latest Israeli exercise comes amid escalating tension between Damascus and Tel Aviv following recent deadly Israeli strikes on Syrian soil. Damascus has condemned the attacks as a violation of its sovereignty. It's too early to say if Israel is trying to open up another war front. However, it may not be wrong to say that the Syrian crisis is taking a new twist amid the West's unrelenting support for the insurgents fighting in Syria and the upcoming Geneva II conference. It seems Western countries are pushing for their own aims. They've spoken of military action against Damascus time and again, saying Syrian President Bashar al-Assad must resign. In the latest sign of support for the militants, the EU has lifted an arms embargo on the insurgents. The US has supported the EU's move, but Russia has warned that it will harm the prospects of success in Geneva II peace conference. The cost of the ongoing conflict in Syria has already been high. As the Syrian crisis drags on, concerns are growing that it will affect not only the whole region, but also the world.
Say that Israel is supporting the insurgency. In other words, it is supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria. This is not known to public opinion, but through the Golan Heights, it is supporting terrorist units of al-Nusra, which are fighting the Syrian government. It has logistics, weapons supplies, Israeli vehicles going into Syrian territory. It also has a hospital facility for the rebels located in the Golan Heights, so that in effect, right from the outset, Israel has been involved in supporting the various factions, so-called Islamist factions, which are, as we know, mercenaries trained in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So that, in effect, we have to ask ourselves, who are the main military actors in the Syrian war theater? The al-Nusra rebels, which allegedly represent the opposition, are supported by the Western military alliance and Israel. These are the foot soldiers of the Western military alliance, and they're waging a war against the Syrian people. Now, when the European Union decides to lift the embargo, the arms embargo, what they really have in mind, it's not to say that they haven't been supplying the rebels with weapons all the time, they have, but what they have in mind is to channel military aid to this mercenary force, which is supported by foreign powers. That is a very different proposition to the Russians or Iran, for that matter, through bilateral agreements providing military assistance to a sovereign country and to a government. And in effect, what we are also dealing with is well, it's illegal under international law, but it is also in violation of U.S. anti-terrorist legislation.
Indeed. Now, Mr. Josodowski, recently U.S. Senator John McCain went to Syria via Turkey. How do you interpret this visit?
Well, John McCain, who is Secretary of State, is actually in blatant violation of U.S. guidelines on anti-terrorism. There's an anti-terrorist list. There's a list of terrorist organizations which is made up by the State Department, and John Kerry is negotiating, interfacing with representatives of that terrorist organization. And the same thing is true for John McCain when he crosses into Syria. Or the same thing is true for the former ambassador to Syria, Robert Stephen Ford, who is also supporting the terrorists. So that we have to distinguish between military aid through official channels from government to government, which is what the Russians are providing to Syria, and on the one hand, and the type of assistance which Israel, Britain, France, the United States are channeling to an illegal organization according to their own criteria.
Right.
So in other words, they should be arrested on anti-terrorist charges because they're on violation of international law. So Western leaders are in effect attempting to build peace and democracy by threatening war. Essentially, that's what they're doing, is they're heightening the threats, they're channeling weapons to the terrorists. Incidentally, those terrorists have been decimated by Syrian armed forces, so that in effect, the Western military alliance is in a dead end. So that they are now considering other options.
Right.
But essentially, if they were concerned and sincerely committed to the peace process, they would immediately cease supporting a terrorist organization which is linked to Al-Qaeda and which is involved in atrocities and killings in Syria.
All right.
Moscow says that it will continue to supply air defense missiles, calling it a balance that is designed to deter foreign intervention inside Syria. The Russian Foreign Ministry says that it will restrain, this is to quote the ministry, some hotheads from escalating the conflict to the international scale. But the United States, as expected, has condemned the sale, while here in Israel, the Israelis are saying that they will act to prevent the S300 missiles from becoming operational on Syrian soil. The Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ayalon says that if the missiles reach Syria, and to quote him, Israel will know what to do. At the same time, controversy continues over the lifting of the EU embargo for lethal aid for the rebels inside Syria. Now, as we know, 25 countries voted against it. Only the UK and France pushed for it, with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel saying that her country will never send arms to the militants in Syria despite this lift. Now, in this interview with Hezbollah TV, the Syrian President Bashar Assad says that there are around 100,000 foreign mercenaries who are fighting on the side of the rebels inside Syria. He says that his government will not stand in the way of groups who want to fight for the liberation of the Golan, and he has warned, to quote him from this interview, that the Syrian army will retaliate immediately to another Israeli strike inside Syrian territory. Washington has said nothing about this huge number of foreign mercenaries operating inside Syria, although it has been critical of Hezbollah fighting on the side of the Syrian President Assad. There is an international peace conference that is being planned in Geneva next month that will be brokered by both the US and Russia. But in the same interview to Hezbollah TV, the Syrian President Assad said that he was not particularly hopeful that anything would come out of this. He did, however, say that Syria will take part, but again that he doesn't expect any kind of big decisions to be made. The opposition, meanwhile, remains divided. This video has emerged from the recent Syrian National Coalition meeting, and it shows the frustration of envoys of both Western and Arab nations when the SNC fails to broaden the coalition by making more seats available. The French ambassador chastised members of the opposition. He was angry over the coalition's failure to agree on introducing new members.
You don't deserve the efforts that we made.
One member replies, asking, will you cut the weapons? The French ambassador then says, did I say so? I didn't say that. What it does seem is that the collapse of the talks had a lot to do with the push and pull of various foreign powers jockeying for influence within the coalition. Was seized in southern Turkey, and that is according to local media reports. The media also saying that they carried a 2-kilogram cylinder with the nerve agent sarin. Now, Turkish authorities haven't yet commented on this report, and we are waiting to hear from them. Britain, the United States and France in the past have said that they believe it is Assad, however, that is using chemical weapons, but they haven't been able to produce any kind of evidence to prove this. The British government has written to the United Nations Ban Ki-moon alleging 3 new incidents of chemical use by Assad's forces. And at the same time, the French government says that it is testing samples that were smuggled out by journalists. But all of this is hearsay at the moment, whereas on the other hand, we have, and here what we're seeing is fighters from the al-Nusra Front allied with the Syrian rebels caught with the sarin nerve agent gas. It is important also to point out and remind our viewers that the United Nations did launch an independent investigation, and what that investigation concluded was that there were signs that rebels have been using the sarin nerve agent. In another investigation that was initiated by the UN chief Ban Ki-moon, that was criticized by Damascus because they said that what Ban Ki-moon was hoping to do was to investigate every site in Syria. And the Syrians said it reminded them of the Iraqi-style investigation into weapons of mass destruction. The use of chemical weapons is banned under international law, and there are concerns by many people that the arguments that they are being used could trigger some kind of international intervention.
Reports of sarin gas found in rebels' possessions seems to be falling on deaf ears in the West. Author and historian Gerald Horne told us earlier not even the threat of chemical weapon use can shake its support for the Syrian opposition.
If the Syrian government had been caught with sarin gas, we would have heard war whoops from Washington, London, and Paris. But of course, this should not come as a surprise to any who've been paying attention. We know that the internationally respected civil servant Carla Del Ponte had basically made a similar discovery and revelation on behalf of the United Nations just weeks ago, which then was refuted by the White House. We also know that in recent days, Senator John McCain of Arizona entered Syria illegally, and news reports indicate that he consulted with the White House before entering Syria. This is a very dangerous turn of events. It's clear that there are those in Washington who would like to intervene in Syria on behalf of the rebels, which is quite curious since al-Nusra Front, which has been designated as a terrorist organization by Washington, is at the tip of the spear in the opposition against President al-Assad.
Since Britain and France blocked attempts to extend the EU embargo on supplying arms to the Syrian rebels, there have been growing fears that the weapons could end up in the wrong hands, and this is why. The Syrian opposition is made up of many divided and often competing factions, and currently there's no force that can represent it as a whole. There's the Syrian National Council, the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, the Supreme Military Council, the Free Syrian Army, the National Coordination Committee, the Jabhat al-Nusra, the Farouk Brigade, and many more. And I'd like to point out that only the NCC says it's open to dialogue with the authorities, while all the others have officially proclaimed their goal is to topple the regime. The only difference being how extreme their approaches are. And here is where these two rebel groups stand out. Jabhat al-Nusra is officially recognized as a terror organization by the US. It's also known for its links to al-Qaeda and for being among the most highly trained rebel forces currently on the ground in Syria. And the Farouk Brigade, perhaps just as notorious after one of its leading commanders was shown eating the body parts of a dead Syrian soldier on video. But despite warnings raised by international human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the rebels have been receiving weapons for some time now. According to Western media reports, the rebels have received 160 plane loads of arms shipments from Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, via Turkey, and then with the cargo smuggled across the border here with Syria. But no matter which rebel group the arms may be destined for, it's also widely recognized that they usually end up in the hands of the best trained and most radical brigades.